Welcome, listener, to the Candlelight Historian. What if I told you that the most important person in any medieval town wasn't the lord in his castle or the priest in his church, but a figure who was part doctor, part magician, and according to some, part devil's apprentice? Forget the heroic image of a brawny artisan nobly hammering a shining sword for a valiant knight. The reality of the medieval blacksmith was far stranger, far darker, and infinitely more difficult. This was a man who stood at a bizarre crossroads of society. His hands were calloused by the most practical of labors, yet his soul was believed to be in constant negotiation with the supernatural. He was a paradox forged in fire. Today, we're pulling back the curtain of myth to reveal the brutal, surprising, and often miserable life of the medieval blacksmith. Part 1. The Devil's Handshake and the Saint's Tongs. To understand the blacksmith, you first have to understand the world he lived in. A world where science, superstition, and faith were tangled together. And in that world, the smith had a very strange reputation. On one hand, he was a healer. This might sound odd, but it followed a certain medieval logic. Barbers were surgeons because their specialty was cutting. By that same token, who better to mend a broken bone than a man who could take two shattered pieces of iron, the strongest metal on earth, and weld them into one unbreakable whole? People would bring their loved ones with fractured limbs to the forge. The injured arm or leg would be laid upon the anvil, and the smith would perform a ritual reforging, sometimes bringing a hammer down near the injury in a symbolic act of mending. Even the dirty water in his quenching trough was considered magical. Known as forge water, people sought it out to cure warts and other skin problems. In Ireland, it was believed that a seventh-generation blacksmith possessed healing powers so great he could succeed where learned doctors had failed. But for every tale of the blacksmith as a healer, there was another that painted him as a consort of the damned. His entire craft, mastering fire, transforming inert rock into gleaming tools, seemed like a form of forbidden magic. The smithy itself, a dark cavern of roaring flames, choking smoke, and deafening noise, was the closest thing on earth to the medieval vision of hell. This association was so strong that some smiths were actually accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. This sinister reputation gave rise to one of the most ancient stories in European history: the smith and the devil. In countless versions of this tale, a smith makes a pact with Satan, trading his soul for the ultimate secrets of the forge. But after gaining this forbidden knowledge, the clever smith uses his new power to trick the devil, often by welding him to an immovable object, until the deal for his soul is cancelled. This strange duality is perfectly captured in the legend of St. Dunstan, the patron saint of blacksmiths. The story goes that the devil visited Dunstan's forge, disguised as a beautiful woman to tempt him. Dunstan, ever perceptive, noticed the cloven hooves beneath her dress. He calmly went back to his work, heated his tongs until they glowed cherry red, and then seized the devil by the nose. The devil's resulting screams were said to have been heard for miles. Dunstan refused to let go until Satan swore an oath to never enter a home protected by a horseshoe hung over the door. This story tells you everything you need to know about how medieval people saw the blacksmith. He was a man who walked with devils, but had the power to master them for the good of the community. He was too important to be an outcast, but far too strange to be fully embraced. Part 2. The Daily Grind. So what was the day-to-day reality that created this reputation? In a word, miserable. The life of a medieval blacksmith was a relentless assault on the senses, an existence defined by brutal physical toil in an environment that can only be described as infernal. A smith's day began in the cold darkness, long before the rest of the village stirred. His first job wasn't forging, but feeding the beast, the forge itself. This meant chopping wood, or more likely, paying for expensive charcoal, a significant daily cost. Then came the back-breaking work of pumping the great bellows, often a job for a weary apprentice, just to get the fire hot enough to begin. Once the forge was alive, the smithy transformed into a microcosm of hell. The first thing that would hit you was the noise. We actually have a first-hand account of this, in what might be the world's first ever noise complaint. In a 14th century poem, a long-suffering neighbor wrote a scathing review of his local smiths. Translated from the original Middle English, it reads, "Black, smoky smiths, besooted with smoke, drive me to death with the din of their blows. Such a noise at night men have never heard. What crying of lads and clattering of knocks! They spit and sprawl and tell many tales. Loos, bus, las, das, such a life they lead. All blacksmiths, Christ give them sorrow. May no man, for these water burners, get any rest at night." Those water burners he mentions, that's the deafening hiss of the smith plunging red-hot iron into water. In the already noisy medieval town, the blacksmith's forge was a concentrated epicenter of auditory misery. The environment was just as punishing. The work was intensely hot, performed in a space thick with soot and grime, wearing a heavy leather apron not for comfort, but as a desperate shield against the constant spray of sparks. And what was the object of all this toil? Not the gleaming swords of legend. For the vast majority of blacksmiths, the work was crushingly mundane. His days were consumed by making nails, and then more nails, and horseshoes, door handles, hinges and kitchen pots. He was, in essence, a glorified repairman, sharpening the farmer's plough and mending his axe. High-quality steel for a sword was an expensive, rare commodity that most village smiths would likely never see in their entire careers. This daily reality, the noise, the filth, the fire risk, created a physical and sensory barrier between the smith and his community, reinforcing the very perceptions that cast him as a figure of both awe and suspicion. Part 3. The body on the anvil. But the noise and the grime were the least of his worries. The forge demanded a physical price, paid in flesh and bone. The rhythmic clang of the hammer was the sound of the blacksmith's own body being slowly and systematically destroyed. Acute injuries were a daily reality. Burns were a constant companion. The greatest menace was scale, the flakes of incandescent iron oxide that flew from the workpiece with every hammer blow. Imagine a red-hot piece of sand flying into your eye or falling into your boot. And speaking of eyes, in an age without safety goggles, a smith's vision was under constant assault. A single unlucky spark could mean partial or total blindness. Historical records are filled with requests from smiths seeking to be excused from taxes because of such accidents. Beyond burns, there were crush injuries from a misplaced hammer blow or broken feet from a dropped tool. And the noise, that relentless percussive roar, would have inevitably led to progressive and permanent hearing damage. but it was the slow, creeping ailments that were often the most fatal. The air in the forge was a toxic soup of smoke and dust from charcoal fires. Without proper ventilation, a smith's lungs would be coated with particulate matter, leading to chronic respiratory diseases like black lung. A 15th century German physician named Ulrich Ellenbog wrote a treatise specifically warning smiths of the poisonous, evil fumes and smoke. He advised them to keep windows open, even in winter, and urged masters not to make their apprentices sleep in the forge, but to provide them with good, clean air. He also warned of another silent killer, heavy metal poisoning. A smith worked with whatever a customer brought him, which could include lead, copper, or brass, all of which release toxic fumes when heated. Modern welders can suffer from metal fume fever, an intense flu-like illness from inhaling zinc oxide. A medieval smith experiencing these chills and nausea would have had no idea his own craft was poisoning him from the inside out. And all of this physical destruction might just solve an ancient mystery. Why are so many blacksmith gods in mythology lame? Figures like the Greek Hephaestus, cast from Olympus for his imperfection, or the Germanic Wayland the smith, who was deliberately hamstrung, are defined by their disabilities. This might not be a coincidence. The high probability of a real-world smith suffering a permanently disabling injury, a crushed foot that never healed right, or chronic arthritis from a lifetime of swinging a heavy hammer, was an observable fact. In a culture that explained the world through stories, it's a small leap to project the common, real-world disabilities of craftsmen onto their divine patrons. The myth of the lame smith may be a cultural fossil, preserving the brutal truth that creation in the forge was inseparable from the destruction of the creator. Part 4. The jingle of coin. So with all this suffering, at least they were rich, right? Wrong. The idea of the prosperous blacksmith is largely a romantic fiction. For most, life was a constant, precarious struggle for solvency. His business was burdened by huge costs. His main raw materials, iron and charcoal, were expensive and had to be bought up front, and the iron he bought was rarely pure. It was often riddled with impurities and slag, meaning he had to spend hours of his own unpaid time and expensive fuel just refining it before he could even start making something profitable. So let's put this in perspective. In 14th century England, a master smith earned about 4 pence a day. Sounds okay, right? Well, his most essential tools, the anvil and bellows, would cost him a combined 150 days of non-stop work. That's half a year's wages before he could even think about feeding his family. Want to buy a cow, a vital household asset? That'll be a full month of your labor. And the gap between the smith and the nobility he served was an unbridgeable chasm. The price of a single warhorse for a night could equal more than 8 years of a master blacksmith's wages. He wasn't forging a fortune, he was forging a survival, one painstaking hammer blow at a time. Part 5. The Gilded Cage. But surely he had his guild to protect him. The worshipful company of blacksmiths, and others like it, are often seen as a brotherhood of artisans. They promise stability, quality control, and a social safety net, even paying for prayers for your soul after you died. In reality, the guild was a double-edged sword. For the masters at the top, it was a way to secure a monopoly. For everyone else, It was often a gilded cage. The journey began as a boy, maybe 7 years old, sent to a master as an apprentice. For the next 7 to 9 years, you'd work for no pay, receiving only room, board, and training. Your job was sweeping the floor, pumping the bellows, and hauling charcoal. If you were lucky, you'd become a journeyman, a skilled craftsman paid a daily wage. But becoming a master, the ultimate goal that allowed you to open your own shop, was nearly impossible. You had to produce a masterpiece, a complex item crafted at your own expense, pay hefty fees, and most importantly, get the approval of the existing masters, the very men who had a direct financial incentive to limit their competition. The guild wasn't a ladder of opportunity. For most, it was a system of control, creating a permanent underclass of skilled workers who were trapped as wage laborers for their entire lives. The greatest threat to a journeyman smith wasn't a greedy lord, but the masters of his own trade. Part 6. A spectrum of smiths. Of course, not all blacksmiths were the same. The term covers a whole spectrum of specialists. At the bottom was the village smith, the jack of all trades and glorified repairman we've been talking about. A step up was the castle smith or armorer. He had more prestige, making weapons and armor for the lord, but he was essentially a high-status servant with no autonomy. Then you had the farrier, a specialist in horses. He was part smith, part veterinarian, and was notorious for setting up shop right in the middle of the street to catch passing trade, becoming a public nuisance. And at the top of the pile was the whitesmith. He worked with white metals like tin and pewter, or did the fine polishing and finishing work. His job was less physically punishing, and he was held in much higher esteem. The life of a smith was dramatically shaped by his specific craft. The poverty of a village smith was a world away from the pressures felt by a royal armorer. Conclusion. The medieval blacksmith, stripped of myth, emerges not as a hero, but as a figure of profound resilience. His life was a battle fought on every front, against his own body, against a precarious economy, and against the very culture that both needed and feared him. His body was a canvas of burns and scars, his ears deafened, his lungs poisoned. He walked a knife's edge of solvency, where his most basic tools cost half a year's wages. He was trapped in a social limbo, feared as a sorcerer, yet revered as a healer. His life was a far cry from the legends. He was more likely to be a deafened, underpaid craftsman, churning out nails in a cloud of toxic smoke, held in a state of simultaneous fear and contempt by his neighbors. His story isn't one of glamour, but of pure grit, a daily struggle for survival. The true legacy of the medieval blacksmith isn't just in the shining swords that survive in museums, but in every humble nail, hinge, and horseshoe that held their world together, each one an echo of the anvil, and a testament to the enduring and often suffering human spirit.